The ground didn't just shake. It sang. A deep, resonant, harmonic hum that vibrated up through the solace of your boots, into your ankles, your knees, your very bones. It was a sound felt more than heard, a constant, pervasive bass note to the symphony of shell fire that raged above. For the men of the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company, 30 meters below the shattered fields of Flanders, this was the soundtrack of their war. Not the sharp crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery, but the groan of stressed earth, the drip of infiltrating groundwater, and the low, ominous hum of the enemy, somewhere in the dark, doing exactly what you were doing, digging. This was the secret war, the war within the war, fought not for yards of mud, but for the very earth itself. A war of geologists and coal miners. Of claustrophobia and collapsing chalk, where the weapon was a shovel and the objective was to place thousands of tons of high explosive directly beneath the feet of the enemy, and then remove the very ground they stood on. The man who brought the idea to the high command was not a soldier, but a scholar. Sir John Norton Griffiths, a flamboyant, bullish English engineer and member of Parliament, known as Empire Jack. He had made his fortune and reputation building railways and tunnels across Africa and the Americas. He was a man who thought in terms of moving mountains, literally. In 1915, visiting the stagnant front, he saw not just trenches, but geology. The British lines in Flanders often sat on low, wet clay. The German lines, just a few hundred yards away, frequently occupied slightly higher ground, ridges of soft, stable chalk. Perfect for digging. The Germans, he learned, were already exploiting this. They were digging deep mines beneath British forward positions, packing them with explosives, and detonating them. The resulting craters were then fortified as new strongpoints, inching the line forward. It was siege warfare on an industrial scale. Norton Griffiths went to the War Office with a simple, terrifying proposition: we have to beat them at their own game. But bigger. We don't just dig to destroy a trench. We dig to destroy a regiment. A brigade. We dig to change the landscape. He was given permission to recruit. He didn't want soldiers. He wanted clay kickers. Coal miners from Wales and the Midlands. Tin miners from Cornwall. Gold miners from Australia and Canada. Men who were intimate with the dark, who understood pressure and timbering, who could read the rock and sense danger in the shift of a pebble. They were enlisted into new, specialist units, the Royal Engineer Tunnelling Companies. They were given military ranks, but they operated by their own ancient, pit-hardened codes. Their commanding officers were often mining engineers in uniform. Discipline was based on mutual survival. A mistake down here didn't mean a dressing down, it meant burial. Private Evan Lucky Jones was one such man. At 42, he was older than the officers, a Welsh anthracite miner from the Rhondda Valley with hands like shovel blades and lungs already speckled with black dust. The army had offered him a way out of the pit. He traded one darkness for another, but this one, he was told, was for king and country. He arrived at the Ypres salient in the bitter winter of 1916. The surface world was a frozen hell of mud and corpses. The underground world, he was promised, was dry. It was a relative term. The tunnel shaft, hidden in the cellar of a ruined farmhouse behind the lines, descended into a clammy, constant chill. The air was thick with the smell of damp clay, sweating men, candle smoke, and the sharp, rotten egg stink of fire-damp methane gas that seeped from the ancient seabed. The tunnel itself was a masterpiece of precarious engineering. Just 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, it was shored up every few feet with timber frame sets made from pit props shipped from English forests. It crawled forward at an agonizingly slow pace, maybe 15 feet a day. The clay kicking technique was brutally physical. The digger lay on his back on a wooden board, using a specially designed spade with a sharp, gouging blade to carve chunks of chalk from the face, which his mate would drag back in a sandbag. Every scrape, every cough, was magnified in the confined space. And every sound had to be listened to. Because 30 meters away, perhaps less, the Germans were listening too. This was the core of the silent duel, listening. In small, cramped dugouts branching off the main tunnel, men called listeners would sit for 8-hour shifts, pressing their ears against the ground or against sticks driven into the tunnel walls, or using primitive geophone stethoscopes for the earth. Their world was one of amplified sound. They heard the scratch 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 of enemy picks, the thud of a falling lump of chalk, the gurgle of a hidden spring. Their job was to map the unseen German tunnel in their mind, to determine its direction, depth, and intent. Was it a fighting tunnel, meant to break into ours for a subterranean raid? Or was it a charged tunnel, heading directly below our trench to plant a mine? The difference dictated the response. If it was a fighting tunnel, you were here for an underground battle, a vicious, close-quarters brawl in pitch darkness with pistols, knives, and clubs. If it was a charged tunnel, you had to dig a countermine a tunnel to intercept and destroy it before it reached its target. The tension was unrelenting. Men developed an almost supernatural hearing. Jones, after a few weeks, could distinguish between the sound of a British pick and a German one. He could hear the enemy miners talking, their voices a muffled, ghostly murmur through the chalk. Once, he clearly heard a German miner singing a folk song, a lonely, echoing sound that hung in the dark long after it stopped. He never mentioned it to the officers. Some things were too human for war. The psychological toll was unique. Topside soldiers feared random death from the sky. Tunnelers feared being trapped, buried alive, or suffocated. A cave-in wasn't an instant death, it was a slow, crushing sentence. Gas was a constant terror. Fire damp could be ignited by a single candle flame, incinerating everyone in the tunnel. Or the Germans might pump poison gas, phosgene or chlorine down their listening shafts. Men worked with naked flames because electric lamps were too dim, living with the knowledge that their light source could also be their funeral pyre. Claustrophobia was a foe as real as the enemy. Strong men would suddenly break, screaming to be let out, clawing at the walls in a panic that could infect an entire shift. Then there were the blows. The sudden, violent intersection of two tunnels. It usually began with a faint trickle of dirt from the face. Then a pick would break through, and a rush of stale, foreign air would mix with your own. What followed was a nightmarish melee in a space no larger than a coffin. No rifles. Revolvers, entrenching tools, sharpened shovels. It was medieval, intimate, and utterly savage. The objective was not just to kill the enemy miners, but to capture their tunnel, to explore it for intelligence, and then to demolish it with a small charge. Jones was in two such blows. In the first, he found himself face to face with a young German, a boy really, their candlelight flickering in each other's wide, terrified eyes. Jones fired his Webley first. The sound in the confined space was deafening, permanently damaging his hearing in one ear. The boy slumped. Jones remembered the clean, new look of the boy's tunic. A replacement. He took a brass button from the tunic as a morbid souvenir, a habit many tunnelers developed. It felt less like killing than like a workplace accident in a shared, deadly mine. But the real purpose, the grand strategy, was not these small, vicious skirmishes. It was the camouflets and the mines. A camouflet was a small, targeted explosion designed to collapse an enemy tunnel without breaking the surface. It was a surgical strike underground. A mine was the apocalypse. The plan for the summer of 1917, part of the larger Messines offensive, was the detonation of not one, not 10, but 19 giant mines beneath the German ridge lines. Years of digging, of nerve-shredding silence and sudden violence, were all leading to this single, earth-shattering moment. The scale of the mining operation at Messines was staggering. Tunnels stretched hundreds of yards from the British lines. Some were over 100 feet deep to avoid German countermining. The main charges were housed in vast chambers, dug with immense care. Jones's company worked on a tunnel codenamed Spanbroek Milan, aimed at the most heavily fortified point on the ridge. The charge chamber took weeks to excavate. It was a cavern in the clay, shored up with massive timber balks. Then came the explosives. Not dynamite, which sweated nitroglycerin in the damp, but aminal, a stable, powerful mixture shipped in thousands of white cotton bags. Each bag weighed 50 pounds. Men formed human chains in the stifling tunnel, passing the bags from hand to hand, for days on end. The aminal dust coated their lungs, their skin, their food. They coughed up pink phlegm. The chamber swallowed 91,000 pounds of aminal over 40 tons. It was the largest of the 19 mines. Positioning the bags was an art. They were stacked like bricks, with a central primer charge of more sensitive guncotton, connected by hundreds of feet of waterproofed firing cable to the surface. The final act was tamping. To direct the explosive force upwards, the tunnel leading back from the chamber had to be sealed with incredible strength. They built airtight bulkheads of sandbags, concrete, and timber, then backfilled the entire length of the tunnel with bags of clay and rubble. It was physical labor of the most brutal kind, done in the knowledge that you were sealing your own work and potentially yourself behind a wall meant to withstand an earth-shattering detonation. When the last bulkhead was complete, there was a strange ceremony. The officer in charge, a Captain Hutton, produced a bottle of whiskey. They drank from tin cups in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the packed earth that now held their monstrous creation. To the Kaiser, Hutton said, with a grim smile. They drank. Then they retreated up the shaft, for the last time. Above ground, the preparations for the Battle of Messines were immense. Tens of thousands of troops moved into position. Artillery batteries were wheeled into place. But for the infantry waiting in the front line trenches, the true secret, the reason for their confidence, lay silently beneath their boots. They had been told, when the mines go up, you walk forward. There will be nothing left to stop you. Many didn't believe it. 0 hour was set for 3:10 a.m. on June 7, 1917. The night was clear and quiet, an unnerving calm before the storm. In deep dugouts far behind the lines, the mining engineers sat at simple wooden boxes, each connected to the firing cables of their specific mine. Jones was with Captain Hutton in the dugout for WW1. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. A clock ticked loudly. At 3 a.m., the British artillery fell silent. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the bombardment. In the German trenches, men would have breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the attack had been called off. They were fatally wrong. At 3:10 exactly, the order was given. Hutton, his hand steady, closed the firing switch. What happened next transcended the experience of war and entered the realm of cosmology. The earth did not explode. It erupted. It was not a series of bangs, but a deep, visceral, world-tearing roar that seemed to come from the core of the planet itself. 19 colossal pillars of fire, dirt, and shattered humanity vomited into the sky. At WW1, the effect was cataclysmic. The ground where the German front line trench had been swelled like a blister, then burst open in a silent, slow-motion fountain of orange flame and black earth that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave ripped across no man's land, flattening men in the British trenches who were not braced. The sound reached London, over 130 miles away, where it was reported as an earthquake. In Lille, 15 miles distant, windows shattered. Jones, in his dugout, was thrown from his feet. The sound was beyond hearing, it was a physical compression of the air, a punch to the entire body. Dust and debris rained down on the dugout roof. When he staggered out into the communication trench, the world had been remade. Where the German ridge had been, there was now a chain of smoking, gaping craters. The largest, his crater, was over 300 feet across and 70 feet deep. Later, they would find German concrete bunkers, intact, that had been thrown hundreds of feet through the air like toys. An entire regiment, the 3rd Bavarian Infantry, had simply ceased to exist. Vaporized, pulverized, or buried alive in an instant. The survivors were not soldiers, they were ghosts, deaf-and, blinded, driven mad, wandering in a landscape that belonged to the moon. The infantry attack that followed was, for the first few hours, a walkover. The British and Anzac troops advanced through a haze of dust and carnage, meeting little coordinated resistance. The mines had done their job with a horrifying, absolute efficiency. The ridge of Messines was taken. It was the most successful single day of the war for the Allies up to that point. But for the tunnelers, there was no triumph, only a hollow, shuddering awe. They had become gods of the underworld, wielders of a power so fundamental it felt sinful. Jones stood at the lip of the Spanbroek crater later that morning, looking into the vast, raw wound in the earth. Water was already seeping into its bottom, forming a greenish lake. Among the scattered chalk and clay, he could see fragments of timber, shreds of grey cloth, and things he refused to identify. The button in his pocket felt heavy. He thought of the singing German boy. This was not that. This was something else. This was geology weaponized. This was the silence of 2 years of digging, culminating in a noise that would echo in the nightmares of a continent. The mines of Messines marked the zenith and the end of large-scale military mining. The technology of war was already moving on tanks, improved artillery, air power. But for a brief, terrifying period, the war had gone underground, fought by men who wrestled with the primal elements of earth and fire in a darkness so complete it became their world. They were the troopers of the deep, the sappers of the apocalypse, and when they finally laid down their picks and shovels, they left behind a landscape permanently scarred by their labors, and a lesson written in colossal craters. That mankind, when pushed to the brink, will not just fight for the land, but will use the very land itself as a weapon, turning the stable ground beneath our feet into an agent of absolute, and terrifying, deliverance. The silence after the mines was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world holding its breath. It was the auditory vacuum left by a sound too vast for human ears to properly register, a ringing emptiness that seemed to suck all other noise into itself. Evan Jones stood at the lip of the Spanbroek crater, the raw, gaping mouth of the earth still steaming in the cool dawn air. The chalk, which had been his daily adversary for months, now lay scattered in grotesque, alien formations. The familiar, almost comforting darkness of the tunnel was gone, replaced by this vast, open wound. It felt obscene, like looking at the inside of a body that should never be seen. The victory was absolute, and it tasted of ashes and aminal dust. Around him, the battlefield moved with the eerie, efficient languor of shock. Anzac and British infantry picked their way through the surreal landscape, not so much advancing as exploring a new, violent geography. The German resistance on this sector of the ridge had been annihilated. Not defeated, erased. The few survivors stumbled about, their faces blank masks of incomprehension, their ears bleeding, their uniforms coated in fine grey dust that made them look like statues coming to life. Jones saw one German soldier sitting perfectly still on the edge of a smaller crater, carefully trying to fit a detached boot onto the wrong foot, his movements methodical and slow, as if in a dream. No one bothered him. The scale of the devastation had created a temporary, mutual truce of awe. Captain Hutton clapped a heavy hand on Jones's shoulder, the gesture making him flinch. "By God, Jones. By God. We did it." Hutton's voice was hoarse, his eyes wide with a fervor that looked like religious ecstasy. He was seeing a mathematical problem perfectly solved, an equation of earth and explosive that had balanced to produce this magnificent, terrible result. Jones just nodded, unable to speak. His own hearing was a muffled roar, as if his head was stuffed with wool. He looked at his hands, still ingrained with the chalk and sweat of the last shift before the tamping. Those hands had helped stack the bags that made this. The connection felt impossible. They were ordered back from the front line, the tunneling companies no longer needed here. The infantry could clean up. Their war, for now, was over. The march back to the reserve lines was through a world transformed. Men from other units stared at them as they passed. Word had spread. These were the men from the deep, the sorcerers who had summoned earthquakes. They were looked upon with a mixture of gratitude, fear, and superstition. Jones caught snippets of conversation, dug right under the bastards. Heard it in bloody Dover. Like the end of the world, mate. He kept his head down. He didn't want their awe. He wanted a bath, and a sleep without dreams of collapsing faces of chalk. The next weeks were a strange anticlimax. They were moved to a quiet sector, given the task of digging shallow, tactical saps for a planned minor offensive that never materialized. The work felt trivial, insulting. After the monumental, patient evil of the Messines tunnels, this was ditch digging. The tension was gone, but so was the purpose. The men became irritable, restless. The close-knit, survival bond of the deep began to fray in the mundane sunlight. Arguments flared over nothing. Jones found himself snapping at his mates, then sitting in silent, shameful apology afterwards. It was during this lull that the ghosts arrived. Not literal specters, but the psychological aftershocks. In the close, total darkness of the tunnel, your mind had been a tool, focused on survival, on listening, on the next foot of progress. Now, in the open air with nothing to focus on, it replayed the archives of terror. Jones would be smoking a cigarette, staring at a wall, and suddenly be back in the moment the pick broke through into the German gallery, the rush of foreign air, the glint of the enemy's eyes in the candlelight. He'd feel the jarring kick of the Webley in his hand all over again. At night, the silence was worse. The constant, comforting groan of the earth was gone, replaced by a ringing emptiness that his mind filled with imagined sounds, the scratch of a pick, the creak of a timber about to fail, the faint, desperate singing of a boy in the dark. He started sleeping during the day, when the noise of the camp provided a buffer. Captain Hutton noticed. He called Jones into his makeshift office, a tent with a desk made from ammunition boxes. "You're jumpy, Jones. The men say you're not sleeping." "I'm all right, sir," Jones mumbled, looking at his boots. "No, you're not. None of us are." Hutton sighed, the evangelical gleam gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep weariness. "What we did. It wasn't normal soldiering. It changes a man. You carry the weight of the earth with you afterwards." He pushed a bottle of whiskey and a tin cup across the desk. "Drink. Talk. Or don't talk. But drink." They sat in silence for a while, the whiskey burning a clean path through the perpetual chalk dust taste in Jones's throat. Finally, Jones spoke, his voice a rough whisper. "That lad, sir, the one in the blow. I heard him singing, days before. Just singing to himself." Hutton nodded slowly. "I heard a harmonica once. Through 3 yards of clay. Played Die Wacht am Rhein. Quite well." He took a swallow. "We forget, down there, that they're men like us. Miners, probably. Saxons, Bavarians. Good clay kickers. It's easier if we forget. What we did at Messines. We didn't kill men. We killed a landscape. We killed a map. That's what you have to tell yourself." But Jones couldn't tell himself that. He had been a miner. He knew the intimate, physical dialogue between a man and the earth. The heft of a pick, the texture of the rock, the sigh of a timber taking the strain. That work had a nobility to it, a creation. You brought coal to the surface to warm homes. You dug ore to make steel. What they had done was the ultimate perversion of that craft. They had used the miner's skills not to bring forth life from the earth, but to inject death into it. They had turned the deep, stable darkness into a hiding place for apocalypse. The earth, which had been a shelter, was now a weapon. The thought felt like a sacrilege. In late July, they were pulled from the line entirely. Not for rest, but for a new, even more secretive project. They were loaded onto trains under cover of darkness, their destination unknown. The journey took 2 days, moving east, away from the familiar muck of Flanders. The landscape changed, becoming drier, more rolling. They detrained in a forest of pine, where the air smelled of resin and dry soil, not decay. They were met by quiet men in plain uniforms who spoke with academic precision. They were geologists, archaeologists, engineers from a special branch of the War Office so secret it didn't have a name. They were taken to a remote chateau, its cellars converted into a map room. On a vast table lay a geological survey map of northern France, but unlike any Jones had seen. It showed layers of rock, substrata, ancient water courses, and faults. An officer with a pointer, a Colonel Liddell, addressed them. "Gentlemen, your expertise is required for a project of the utmost delicacy. We are not digging towards the enemy here. We are digging away from him." The plan was called Operation Alberich, after the malicious dwarf of Germanic myth, but in reverse. German intelligence had learned of a massive, final Allied offensive being planned for the spring of 1918, what would become the last-ditch efforts to break the Hindenburg Line. British High Command, in a move of staggering ambition, wanted to preempt it. Not with an attack, but with a theft. The intelligence suggested the Germans were using a series of natural limestone caves and quarries near the town of St. Quentin as bomb-proof headquarters, ammunition dumps, and barracks for entire regiments. The geology was perfect, deep, stable, dry. The plan was to find an unknown access point. Tunnel in from an unexpected direction, not from the front, but from the side, through a forgotten medieval subterranean quarry system, and plant the largest concentrated explosive charge of the war, not to destroy a trench, but to collapse an entire underground city. To swallow a division whole. Jones listened, a cold fascination cutting through his numbness. This was not battlefield mining. This was strategic assassination via geology. It was the Messines idea scaled up and applied with surgical, terrifying precision. They were no longer sappers, they were subterranean burglars. The work began in a secluded valley 5 miles from the suspected cave network. The entrance was a disguised sinkhole, covered with brush. The air inside was cool, constant, and smelled of ancient, undisturbed stone. It was not chalk, but hard limestone. The sound of their picks was different, a higher, sharper ping. It was brutally hard work, but clean. No water seepage. No constant fear of immediate collapse. The danger here was different, getting lost in the labyrinth, or breaking into the wrong cavity and alerting the Germans. They worked in absolute silence, communicating by hand signals. The tunnel progressed slowly, following the map drawn from old parish records and the guesses of the geologists. Jones felt a strange, professional pride returning. This was a pure mining problem. The enemy was an abstract, a presence on a map. The immediate adversary was the rock itself. For the first time in months, he slept deeply after a shift, exhausted by clean, physical labor. After 3 weeks, the tunnel intersected with an ancient, man-made passage. The walls were rough-hewn, showing the marks of medieval picks. It was a forgotten limestone quarry, last worked in the 16th century. According to the maps, this network ran for miles, a hidden world beneath the French countryside. It was their highway. They advanced through the medieval galleries, their electric torches casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They passed eerie remnants of the old miners, a broken wooden cart, a rusted iron pick head embedded in the wall, a niche that might have held a candle. It felt like walking through a cathedral of labor, a sacred space they were about to desecrate. Jones ran his hand over the centuries-old tool marks, feeling a kinship with the long-dead men who had worked here. He wondered what they would think of his mission. The listening posts became critical again. But now they weren't listening for picks, they were listening for life. Using specially amplified geophones, they pressed them against the limestone walls, listening for the echoes of a hidden world. And they heard it? At first, faint and confused, the distant, metallic clang of a door? The hum of a generator? The murmur of voices, so faint it could be the blood in their own ears. But as they tuned their instruments and their senses, the ghostly audio landscape of the German underground fortress resolved. They heard marching boots, echoing down stone corridors. They heard shouted orders in guttural German. They heard the clatter of a mess tin, and once, incredibly clearly, the strains of a gramophone playing a Wagner opera. The sheer, bizarre normality of it was chilling. Thousands of men, living a parallel existence directly below the French soil, waiting for the spring offensive. Their goal was a specific chamber, identified by the geologists as a critical load-bearing juncture in the cave system, directly below the suspected main command bunker. It took another week of painstaking, silent navigation through the ancient quarries to pinpoint it. The chamber, when they finally broke into it, took their breath away. It was vast, a natural cathedral of stone, with a high, vaulted ceiling hung with stalactites like stone icicles. In the center of the floor was a deep, still pool of black water, fed by a subterranean spring. The acoustics were incredible, a whisper echoed for seconds. This was the place. The water posed a problem. The aminal charges had to be kept dry. They built a floating platform of timber and tarpaulins, anchoring the explosive bags on it, arranging them in a shaped charge designed to blow the ceiling upwards and bring the entire weight of the limestone roof down onto the complex below. The quantity was smaller than Messines, a mere 20 tons, but the positioning was everything. It was a scalpel, not a club. The work of placing the charge was done in a state of near religious reverence. The chamber was beautiful, a natural wonder. Destroying it felt like an act of vandalism against the earth itself. Jones, helping to position the final primer charge, looked up at the delicate stalactites. Thousands of years of slow, patient dripping had created them. In a few days, a few seconds of man-made violence would turn them to dust. The war's arrogance knew no bounds. As they finished the tamping, sealing the access tunnel with masonry to contain and direct the blast, a new sound began to filter through the rock. Not the mundane sounds of the garrison, but something more urgent. The distant thunder of artillery, muffled but growing. The spring offensive had begun, ahead of schedule. The Germans were under attack from above. Their hidden sanctuary was about to become a tomb, and they didn't know it. The firing decision was not theirs. It would be triggered remotely, coordinated with a massive Allied artillery barrage and infantry assault designed to drive the Germans into their deep shelters just as the mine detonated. They withdrew from the cave network, back through the medieval tunnels, sealing passages behind them. Their part was done. They emerged into the valley to a world at war. The sky to the east was lit with the flicker of 1,000 gun flashes. The air trembled with the continuous roll of the barrage. It was March 21, 1918. The German spring offensive, Operation Michael, had begun with devastating force. The front was in flux. Their secret mission was now a race against the collapsing line. They were evacuated hastily, retreating west with other specialist units as the German stormtroopers advanced. Jones saw the war from a new perspective, not from a static trench or a deep tunnel, but from the chaos of a retreat. Roads choked with refugees and panicked troops. The orderly world of maps and geology was gone, replaced by primal fear. He lost sight of his company, was swept up in a tide of dispirited men. For 2 days, he was just another retreating soldier, his tunneling expertise worthless. He finally found elements of his unit regrouping in a shattered village. Captain Hutton was there, his face grim. "The charge is still armed," he told Jones quietly. "The timers are set. But the forward observation posts have been overrun. We don't know if the Germans are in the caves, or if our lads are above them. The link is broken. It could go up at any moment. Or never." It was the ultimate nightmare for a miner. An orphaned charge. A weapon of unimaginable power, buried in the earth, with no one to command it, a silent, ticking heart of violence waiting for a signal that might never come. It was the perfect metaphor for the war itself, a machine of destruction that had taken on a life of its own, beyond human control. Jones spent the next week in a state of suspended dread, waiting for news, for a distant rumble that would signal the culmination of their work. It never came. The German offensive eventually lost momentum, stalled by logistics and Allied resistance. The line restabilized, miles behind where it had been. The cave network at St. Quentin was behind German lines again. Their masterpiece, their geological assassination, was lost. A 20-ton secret buried in a French hillside. The war ended for Evan Jones not with the armistice in November, but with that silent, unresolved tension. He was demobbed in early 1919, given a train ticket back to Wales. He returned to the Ronda, to the black dust and the narrow valleys. He went back into the pit. The darkness was the same, but it was different. He could never hear the creak of a pit prop without flinching, waiting for the roar. He worked in silence, his damaged ear a permanent reminder of the world of amplified sound. He never spoke of the tunnels, of the singing boy, of the cathedral chamber, or the lost charge. It was a world too alien, too heavy, to share. But he followed the news. In 1923, a local newspaper in Amiens reported a strange geological event near the old St. Quentin front. A series of massive, inexplicable sinkholes had appeared in a remote valley, collapsing part of a hillside. Geologists were baffled. The article speculated about underground watercourses or a forgotten mine collapse. Jones read it in his tiny terraced house, the print smudged by coal dust fingers. He read it, and then carefully cut it out. He folded it and placed it in the same tin box where he kept the brass button from the German boy's tunic. Two relics of the silent war. One, a small, personal death. The other, a vast, anonymous, geological shrug. The charge had finally found its signal, perhaps from a stray current, a shifting rock, or just the slow patience of the earth itself, tired of holding so much violence. The war was over, but the deep earth had finally spoken, swallowing the evidence of its own intended crime. He closed the tin box. The silence, at last, was complete. The silence after the guns was the loudest sound Evan Jones ever heard. It wasn't the absence of artillery, or the cessation of the deep, industrial hum that had been the bass note to his world for 4 years. It was a different kind of quiet, one that settled inside the hollows left behind, a quiet that had texture and weight. He sat in his small kitchen in the Ronde Valley, the black dust of the morning shift still etched in the lines of his hands, and listened to the domestic silence of 1924. A kettle steaming on the hob. The tick of a clock. The distant shout of a child in the street. These were soft, surface sounds. Beneath them, in the permanent, low-ringing tinnitus of his damaged ear, the true silence echoed. The silence of the deep clay. The silence after the mine at Spanbroek-Molen had finished speaking. The silence of the lost charge in the French limestone, which he now knew had finally, years later, collapsed into itself with a sigh that made the newspapers speculate about ferry forts and underground rivers. The documentary of his war was not recorded in film or official history. It was inscribed in the geology of 2 continents, and in the fault lines of the men who moved it. It was written in the craters. Not just the 19 monstrous scars at Messines, which would slowly fill with water to become serene, deadly ponds, but in the smaller, more intimate cavities. The camouflage craters that pockmarked no man's land like acne. The sudden dips in French fields where a listening post had been blown inward, the subsidence over a collapsed gallery that would, decades later, make a farmer's tractor lurch unexpectedly. For the tunnelers, the war did not end on November 11, 1918. It ended slowly, unevenly, as the earth gradually reclaimed their violence or fossilized it. They returned to the world of light carrying the darkness with them like a second skin. They were men out of time. Their skills were those of a pre-industrial craft: the pick, the shovel, the listening ear applied with industrial age ferocity. In a war that birthed tanks and aerial bombardment, they had fought like medieval sappers under a besieged castle, or like miners in a hellish, reciprocal pit. They had no parades. Their victories were not measured in captured towns, but in cubic yards of displaced earth and tons of explosive placed with malignant precision. Their heroism was not the brief, fiery courage of going over the top, but the long, cold, daily courage of descending into the dark, into air that could kill you, into a silence that could betray you, onto a floor that could become your ceiling. The psychological landscape they inhabited was unique. The infantryman's terror was of the sky-falling shells, bullets from an unseen enemy. The tunneler's terror was of the earth itself becoming the enemy. It was a fundamental betrayal. The ground, the one thing that is supposed to be solid, reliable, the foundation of everything, became a trembling, treacherous, lethal entity. You could not trust it. It could listen to you. It could collapse on you. It could be used by your enemy to deliver death from directly beneath your feet. This bred a particular kind of trauma, a deep-seated anxiety that never fully left. Men who had been tunnelers would wake in the night feeling the walls of their bedrooms pressing in, or start at the rumble of a distant train, mistaking it for the fatal blow. They sought work in open spaces, on railways, on farms, under the vast sky. The pit, for men like Jones, was a return to the familiar devil, a darkness he understood, one that at least promised coal, not carnage. But the legacy of their war was more than personal. It marked a terrifying evolution in warfare. For the first time, the battlefield became truly three-dimensional. The war was not just on the surface and in the air, it plunged deep into the subterranean world. The tunnelers turned the Earth's crust into a contested territory. They weaponized geology itself. At Messines, they didn't just attack the German army, they attacked the German position, using the ridge's own physical structure as the means of its destruction. It was environmental warfare on a localized, apocalyptic scale. They proved that with enough determination, you could rewrite the map, not with ink, but with high explosive and displaced strata. This silent war also represented the ultimate industrialization of the individual soldier's effort. The infantryman fired a rifle, a personal weapon. The artilleryman served a gun, a crew-served weapon. The tunneler was a component in a vast, slow-motion machine. His pick stroke was one of millions. His listening shift was a tiny data point in a weeks-long acoustic survey. He was a human drill bit, a biological listening device. The monumental results, the mines that could be seen from the air, the shock waves felt across the channel, were so disconnected from the cramped, claustrophobic, inch-by-inch labor that produced them as to seem magical. This disconnect, between the intimate, sweaty, terrifying work and the cataclysmic result, left a profound moral disorientation. You could not see the enemy you killed. You heard him, you imagined him, but in the final act, you simply moved a mountain onto him. The guilt was geological, not personal. It was a burden as heavy as the earth they had moved. For the nations above, the tunnelers were a useful, then forgotten, weapon. Their moment of supreme utility, the preparation for Messines, was a masterpiece of planning and execution that delivered a flawless tactical victory. But the war moved on. The sheer, grinding slowness of mining warfare could not keep pace with the desperate mobility of 1918. The tank, the coordinated combined arms assault, the airplane, these were the future. The great mines of Messines were the zenith of a dying art, the last and greatest act of siege warfare in history. After that, the war went horizontal and motorized. The men who fought with picks became anachronisms. Yet, their impact lingered in the collective unconscious. They had touched something primal. The idea of men fighting in darkness, of battles in the underworld, tapped into ancient myths, the descent into Hades, the journey through the labyrinth. Their war had a mythological quality that the mud-filled trenches of Passchendaele, for all their horror, lacked. It was a war of echoes and ghosts, of sounds in the dark and sudden, total silence. It was a war fought on the threshold of the living world, in a borderland between life and burial. Today, the physical evidence is softening. The craters at Messines are now tranquil ponds, ringed with trees, visited by history pilgrims who try to comprehend the scale of the violence that formed them. The underground cities, both German and British, have mostly collapsed or been sealed. The tunnel systems are flooded, their timber supports rotted to pulp. The earth is healing its wounds. But if you know where to look, you can still see the scars. A sudden dip in a Belgian field. A strangely precise pond in the middle of a farmer's land. A section of preserved trench that shows the crude, desperate architecture of a deep dugout. And in places, the silence still holds echoes. In the excavated tunnels at the Memorial Museum Passchendaele, or in the preserved Wellington Quarry at Arras, you can descend into the cool, still air. You can feel the oppressive weight above you. You can see the pick marks on the chalk walls, sometimes with the fingerprints of the man who made them still visible in the soot from his candle. In that silence, if you listen with more than your ears, you might hear it, the ghostly scratch 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 of a pick, the muffled murmur of voices speaking in low, tense tones, the distant, imagined hum of the enemy countermining. You are standing in a cathedral of human effort and fear. The tunnelers' war was the war's dark, secret conscience. While the world tore itself apart on the surface, they fought a private, parallel war in the kingdom of gloom. They were the war's miners, extracting not coal or metal, but a terrible, explosive victory from the very bones of the earth. They traded sunlight for the perpetual night of the sap, fresh air for the stale breath of the deep, the horizon for the 4-foot-high face of clay that was their entire world. When Evan Jones died in 1963, an old man in a Welsh valley, his obituary in the local paper said only, "Evan Jones, retired miner. Served with distinction in the Great War." It did not mention the clay kicking, the listening posts, the breath-held moments in total darkness, the singing German boy, or the cataclysm at Spanbroek Milan. That history was buried with him, and with the last of his comrades. The official documentaries would focus on the trenches, the poets, the big pushes. The silent war remained just that, silent. But its legacy is the ground beneath our feet. In those regions of France and Belgium, the earth is not innocent. It is a palimpsest, a document written and rewritten by violence. The topsoil holds shrapnel and bones. The substrata hold the ghosts of tunnels, of chambers packed with ammonal, of men listening intently for the sound of other men in the dark. The great mines were the loudest single man-made noises in history until the atomic bomb, a fact that binds the first industrial total war to the nightmares of the nuclear age. It was a threshold moment, the point at which human conflict gained the power not just to scar the landscape, but to alter its fundamental anatomy. So the documentary ends not with a veteran's tearful remembrance, but with a slow, aerial shot over the Belgian countryside near Ypres. The fields are green and orderly. Roads stitch them together. Then the camera descends, and we see them, a chain of perfectly round, tree-lined ponds, arranged in a gentle arc across the land. They look natural, peaceful. Ducks swim on them. The water is dark and still. The camera dips below the surface, into the cool, greenish gloom, drifting down, down, past curious fish, to the muddy, silent bottom. There, half buried, we see not a shell or a rifle, but a single, massive, moss-covered timber beam, a pit prop from an English forest, set there by the hands of a Welsh miner named Evan Jones in the year 1916. It holds nothing up now. It is just a relic in the deep, a marker in the silent, flooded cathedral of the war beneath the war. The frame holds on it, as the last of the light from the surface fades away, leaving only the eternal dark and the memory of a hum in the earth, a song of terrible power, now finally, completely, silent. The war is over. The earth has closed. But down here, in the deep, the proof remains.